That's a scene from the Martin Scorsese movie, The Last Temptation of Christ, based on the novel by Nikos, and I always have trouble saying this, Kazantzakis. And we're going to go into that a little bit. What I love about that scene in Nikos's further explanation of that story is that it's obvious in that between the time that we're called back to life and what comes after, there's usually a whole lot more to be done. We need to be unwrapped. We engaged this story a few weeks ago during Lent, and not a bad sermon on that, to be honest. And we looked at the four ideas in this passage: the fact that he stinketh, the fact that Jesus wept, the call to come out, and the call to unbind him or unwrap him. And you can go back and review that if you'd like. And we're going to focus this Sunday on that last part. Unbind him. Unwrap him. Even in the process of metamorphosis, when new life has occurred, there is often more unwrapping to do. And Kazantzakis makes that very clear in his description of Lazarus after he is raised from the dead. Fatigued and reticent, Lazarus sat in the darkest corner of the house, for light bothered him. His legs, arms, and belly were swollen and green like those of a 4-day corpse. His bloated face was cracked all over and exuded a yellowish-white liquid which soiled the white shroud which he continued to wear. It had stuck to his body and could not be removed. In the beginning, he had stunk terribly, and those who came close held their noses, but little by little the stench had decreased, until now he smelled only of earth and incense. From time to time he shifted his hand and removed the grass which had become tangled in his hair and beard. His sisters, Mary and Martha, were cleansing him of the soil and the small earthworms which had attached themselves to him. Quite a graphic description, isn't it, of what one might look like after they were raised from the dead. There's still some cleaning up to do. There's still some waking up to do in the process of transformation, in the process of metamorphosis, which is so beautifully shown in this call of Jesus after Lazarus had come out of the tomb. Unbind him. Unwrap him. So my question for us this morning, as individuals, as a church, as a society, what is it from which we desire to be unwrapped? And you might be sitting there and you might think of, well, I can't think of anything. And okay, so just sit tight for the next 10 minutes and we'll have crackers and juice and we can go. But if you're sitting there and you're thinking, oh, there is something that I wish to be unwrapped from. There is stuff that's still sticking to me in my process of emerging, my process of metamorphosis, my process of practicing resurrection. Then maybe we can engage that for a few minutes. Because I don't know about you, but there's tons of stuff that I need to be unwrapped from. On a nearly daily basis, I proclaim with Paul from Romans chapter 7 The good stuff that I want to do, I don't. And the stuff that I don't want to do, I do. What is the answer to that? There might be some things that we need to be unwrapped from that we continue to hold on to. Maybe it's just anger that we can't seem to let go of. Maybe it's habits that have just become so ingrained that there seems to be no hope for them. We gather here this morning after another story of a mass shooting. 9 people killed in Texas at a shopping mall yesterday. Nearly a daily basis now that we hear those stories. And yet, can y'all hear that out there, or is it just in this? And yet, we throw our hands up in the air and say that there's nothing that we can do. Well, there has to be something that we can do. There has to be a way to change the story. There has to be a way to continue to unwrap ourselves so that we can live in love and not constantly hear of stories of people being killed. Sometimes what we need to be unwrapped from is patterns of behavior in our life that keep us from getting to where we need to go. I read a book several months ago by a rabbi named Morton Friedman called Failure of Nerve, and he talks about systems and families and systems and organizations and churches that keep us from being everything that we're called to be and providing the leadership that we need to provide. And he talks about, well, that's the title of the book, that basically that's a failure of nerve. And so I was sitting out by the pool at our apartment complex and reading that. And then there was this phrase that came up, and he says, what happens is leaders, good leaders, well-intentioned leaders, start to lean into competence and civility and empathy. Neither of those are bad things. But he says what we do is we lean into that and neglect developing ourselves and self-differentiating ourselves. And that keeps us from providing effective leadership to the organizations in which we're involved. And it's like, oh my goodness, there's nothing like sitting by the pool and having someone peer into your soul and call you out. And so there was a recognition of the fact that I have some work to do in unwrapping those behaviors in my life, which led me to engaging a coach and a therapist, because here's the thing, we can't unwrap ourselves by ourselves any better than we can pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. Jesus called to the crowd around him when he called Lazarus out of the tomb, unbind him, let him go. There was Mary and there was Martha picking the dirt and the worms off of Lazarus after he had come out of the tomb. What an incredible picture that is. Sometimes what we need to be unwrapped from is the systems of beliefs that we have grown up with and we have internalized. I'm going to go down just a quick rabbit hole, and it's dangerous doing this because this could be a whole sermon in itself. But as I was researching this story this week, ran across an article by scholar Diana Butler Bass. And so we understand this story to be about Mary and Martha and Lazarus in John chapter 11. And we conflate that with the story of Mary and Martha and Lazarus in Luke chapter 10, where Mary is at the feet of Jesus and Martha's serving. Great story, important story, but there's new scholarship that reveals that these are probably two entirely different families. And it was discovered by a singer-songwriter named Libby Schrader, who just had a special affinity to Mary Magdalene, wrote a song about Mary Magdalene, but just wanted to do more. She asked those around her, well, what should I do to learn more about Mary Magdalene? They suggested that she go to seminary, so she went to seminary and got her master's degree and did her thesis on Mary Magdalene. And she was trying to figure out the best way to do that. And she had a professor that said, well, new manuscripts are coming online all the time. Manuscripts that used to be kept in libraries that only people with wealth or authority could look at are on the internet now, and you can look at that. So she went to a document called Papyrus 66, which is the very first known manuscript of the Gospel of John, probably written 200 years after Jesus. And she discovered an interesting thing about this passage. That very first line, which reads in all of our Bibles about Lazarus in the village of Mary and Martha, his sisters, isn't what that Papyrus 66 reads at all. The only thing that's mentioned is Lazarus and his sister, Mary. It's not Lazarus and Mary and her sister, Martha. It's Lazarus and his sister, Mary. All in that passage, there's just Mary. Later manuscripts turn the Greek word, which is similar to Maria, M-A-R-I-A, they crossed out the I and put in a T-H. So it's M-A-R-T-H-A. And changed all the pronouns from her to his. So this is Lazarus and his sister Mary. And there's all kind of Marys in the New Testament. It's a common name. But what scholars think now, men, this isn't going to make much difference to us. But women, listen to this. What scholars think happened is that was intentional. And that this could likely have been Mary Magdalene and not Mary, this sister of Martha. And that the reason that might have been changed was because the verse that Carol ended with, this Christological confession, where it's not Martha that says that, but Mary Magdalene that says to Jesus, "You are the Christ, the Messiah." Who's the other person that said that in Christian scripture? You remember Peter. And how'd Peter make out with that? Peter's the head of the church because of that confession. So here is the possibility that not only in Christian tradition did Peter make that confession, but that Mary Magdalene made that confession as well. And then you might ask, if you're following along, which hopefully a couple of you are by now, if you're following along with saying, well, that Mary is in Bethany. We thought Mary was from Magdala. And there's the possibility that Magdala isn't where Mary was from, but that it was a title given to Mary. Magdala means tower. Mary, the tower. Just like there was Peter, the rock, that was ahead of the church. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the tower, could have been another prominent leader of that early church and was sought to be obfuscated because of that. The belief systems, the stories that we've grown up with, sometimes we need to be unwrapped from. And that is a process. What Lazarus shows us, I think, very clearly. I think we connect with it because we long to be metaphorically raised from the death that we're in. But what Lazarus teaches us is it's not just 3 words and done. That the process of being unwrapped takes time. Being unwrapped when we have outlived so many of our loved ones and loneliness creeps up on us is hard. Being unwrapped when fears that we have for our children are suddenly founded is hard. Being unwrapped when we lose our struggle with addiction again and have to seek help and forgiveness of our loved ones is hard. Being unwrapped when depression takes over is hard. Being unwrapped when relationships fall apart is hard. Being unwrapped when the diagnosis keeps our bodies distant is hard. Being unwrapped when the treatment feels worse than the disease is hard. Being unwrapped when the politics of our world seems so cruel and divisive is hard. We know the messiness of being unwrapped. It doesn't just happen with a few steps over the threshold. If we're honest, we might confess that sometimes that messiness keeps us from even trying. Because we also know when Lazarus is unwrapped, he's someone different than he was in the tomb. Chrysalises' paragraph makes that so clear. Feeling his way toward Jesus' voice. Healing, recovery, grieving is a process that's not without messiness, the messiness of our humanness. Unwrapping takes perseverance and hope, and it takes staying in Lazarus' shoes, if you will. Psychologist Joan Balker reminds us that every major life change destroys the equilibrium of our lives and our self-image and leaves us behind a portion of the old self. Most of us are at some level conservatives. That woke you up, didn't it? Even if the new self is better, we feel some sadness at leaving the old one behind. Lazarus represents that destruction of our equilibrium. He gives us room to grieve our resurrections. And there is some grief involved in that. But here's the thing. He does come out. We are not bystanders at Lazarus' tomb. We are each of us him. And like him, we are reminded what it means to be fully human, to be loved, no matter how much we change. Let's pray together.